Well, again, thank you all for coming today. We're going to get started very quickly. And I'll say from the outset, we hope to get a lot of questions from the audience. And in the next few minutes, make this, I think we all agree, we want to make it as conversational as possible and have a discussion amongst ourselves and with all of you. I'll be brief on the introductions because I think all of these gentlemen are very well known. Jack Reed, Army Ranger, West Point graduate, only one of 8 senators to have done that. His father, Joe, a World War II veteran in combat in the Pacific, who came home from the war to work as a school janitor and work in the city school system to support his children and family. And we'll add the title at the end of all of that, Senator, but I think the other stuff is a lot cooler. Has jumped out of more than 30 perfectly good airplanes in his career as a Ranger. Bill Lynn, Chief Executive Officer of DRS Technologies, and of course, extremely well known to the Pentagon Press Corps for many years, most recently having served as the 30th Deputy Secretary of Defense from 2009 to 2011. I'm already out of order, look at me, pardon me. Eric Edelman, next to Senator Reed, career minister, of course, in the U.S. Foreign Service with the State Department, a distinguished fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, also very well known to the Pentagon Press Corps. Always says hello to us in the hallway as we try and hunt him down for news and keeps moving. Never gives up anything. Bill Lynn, J.D. Crouch, of course, currently Chief Executive Officer of Kinetic North America. Prior to this, of course, extremely distinguished career as the Deputy National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. And my good buddy on the end, Tom Donnelly, Defense and Security Policy Analyst and Co-Director of the Marilyn Ware Center for Security Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. We're going to follow the format that other panels are following here this morning. Have everybody say a few words, have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then very quickly hope to bring you all in with a number of questions. So I'm going to start, go right down the line, and ask Senator Reed to kick it off for us.
Well, thanks very much, Barbara. It's a privilege to be with my colleagues on the panel. All of them have devoted themselves to serving the nation and thoughtfully analyzing national security issues, and I'm delighted to be here. Let me just make a few quick points. One is we are right now in a post-Iraq Afghan war syndrome. We had the same phenomenon post-Vietnam. One of the most obvious manifestations is the fact that there is a real and widely shared inhibition about, in the words of many of my colleagues, putting boots on the ground. And that has several effects. One is it narrows the spectrum of our options, and it also sort of, in some cases, makes less credible, less coercive means, both diplomatic and military means. It also tends, and this gets back to the issue of budget and strategy, to justify in some respect smaller land forces, certainly, and also not put the premium on readiness that would otherwise be the case. And then there is a growing, I think, sense in the political discussion of a neo-isolationism, and it's not restricted to one side or the other. It is, I think, cropping up in different areas in political discourse. And all these factors are shaping our ability to create strategy, to modify strategy, and to deal with the attendant issue of a huge budget pressure on the Department of Defense as well as other agencies of the federal government. Let me also point out, obviously we'll get into, I think, more detail, is technology is going to shape our response. And I don't think it's just the technology of cyber offense, cyber defense, et cetera. There's another phenomenon going on now with social media, and that's the individualized information. And so it's very difficult for any leader to build a cohesive message and cohesive support when you have so many individual channels of communication. And that's going to be a phenomenon that will get more and more complicated as the years roll forward. I would think also we have to think in terms of strategy and budgets about not just traditional opponents, but these huge climactic occurrences. The Philippines is a case in point just today. Barbara reminded me that we have as many forces committed now or in process of commitment to the Philippines for relief as we do in in Afghanistan. And this is going to be an issue we have to deal with. Because I think it goes not just to the issue of providing help to people. Some of these effects will undermine very limited governing capacity of countries. And in those areas that can't be governed, there is the opportunity for not only the growth of terrorism, but for the instability that breeds violence and breeds further instability regionally. There are many other issues we can touch upon, but those are some of the major ones that I think I'd like to mention as to encourage discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Edelman?
Thank you, Barbara. First, I'd just like to say that when I was Undersecretary, it was a great privilege to work with Senator Reid on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I think he always approached all the national defense issues in a really I wouldn't say bipartisan, nonpartisan manner, as I think the committees should. I was a little puzzled in a way at the title of the panel, which was Will Strategy Shape Events or Events Shape Strategy, because I recall that Harold Macmillan, when he left office as Prime Minister, was asked by an intrepid graduate student what driving factors had driven his national security policy when he was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he said, events, dear boy, events. And in his recent magisterial history of strategy, Lawrence Friedman uses as an epigraph a comment from Mike Tyson, which is pretty much in the same vein. Everybody has a plan until they get hit in the head. So my view is that, it's better to have a strategy than not, because if you have a theory of the case, it helps you address a complex set of problems. And the national security environment we face today is about as complex as I think we've ever faced as a nation. We've got the rise of China. We've got the continuing threat of jihadist terrorism. We've got a struggle for power going on in the Persian Gulf with the potential of an emerging nuclear power there. We've got the problem that Senator Reid talked about of failed and failing states and lack of government capacity, which can exacerbate the jihadist problem or create other kinds of problems for us. It doesn't necessarily only connect to jihadism. One can imagine, for instance, the collapse of North Korea, for instance, as an example of that. And the potential for resource-driven conflicts, again, going to the climactic issues and water and energy resources as well. 3 years ago, when Dr. Crouch and I served on the Independent Defense Panel, along with Senator Talent and Rudy DeLeon, who I see here somewhere back there in the audience, and Tom Donnelly was on the staff, we concluded that based on both our formal strategy documents, but also informally the way the United States had acted over the years, we had 4 sort of core national security objectives. 1, protect the homeland. 2, ensure unimpeded access to sea, air, outer space, and cyberspace. 3, maintain a balance of power in Europe and Asia, and from the 1970s on, essentially the Middle East, to prevent anybody from dominating those regions. Provide for the global common good, to do what our sailors, Marines, and other folks are doing right now in the Philippines. And the question, I think, today is looking out to 2025, will we be able to continue to do those things? And I would say under the Budget Control Act caps, much less sequester, I think the answer is at least in question. In my view, probably the answer is no. And the danger there, I think, is that we not have a debate that I think we must have, which is either we have a strategy-driven defense where we provide the resources necessary to fund the strategy, or, as Secretary Gates suggested during his valedictory tour when he was leaving office, tell us what we're not going to do. What among those things I listed are we not going to do anymore or do less of? The danger I think we face is that, and I think this goes to a point that Senator Reid made quite well. The Secretary has said that given the constricted environment he's operating in, he's going to prioritize future capability over current capacity and sacrifice some readiness. There is a lot of sense in that, but there's also a danger. And the danger is that we find ourselves in the position that Britain did between the wars, when it decided that it was not going to fight a war for the next 10 years. That was the budgetary rule they used as they put together the defense budgets. And each year they rolled that 10-year standard forward. And by the time they found that they had to rearm in 1938, they had done so much damage to their defense industrial base that they were unable to recover. And therein, I think, lies the challenge for us.
Bill?
Thanks, Barbara. It's great to be here. It's such an amazing institution and with a great panel. And I think the goal of strategy is straightforward to state. Eric, I think, stated it well, but it's basically, I think, to shape events in directions that serve and protect our interests. The challenge, I think, has grown far more difficult since President Reagan, actually, was in office. Not that it was easy then, but in the 80s and before, the Soviet Union was the defining existential threat. And it was that way for decades, and it allowed a certain stability to the planning. And we developed strategies, containment, others to deal with that threat. We now face a world that, as Eric went through, is far, far more complex. We have the rise of China, the potential of a nuclear Iran, the reality of a nuclear North Korea, the instabilities in the Middle East, the globalization of terror, all of which require different types of resources, different types of strategies, and the challenge is how do you develop strategic planning in the face of that uncertainty. And I would argue that what we ought to think about is we ought to shift a bit the paradigm of strategy development that we've had, that we ought to focus on what we know and less on what we don't. And what we don't know is when, where, and who we're going to fight. Secretary Gates, my old boss, captured this by saying over the last 2 to 3 decades, we've had an absolutely perfect record in predicting this. We have never gotten it right. And so what that suggests to me is that we ought to spend more time thinking about trends in warfare, trends in technology, trends in demographics. Where are these things going to lead us? What does the rise of asymmetrical capabilities mean for our military? The importance of cyber, the importance of long-range strike, almost no matter what scenarios we might face. And indeed, what I would say is that we should move more towards a capability-based planning model and away from a scenario-based planning model. In the Cold War, when we had some ability to predict the scenarios, I think scenario-based was stronger. Now, as I think, as I suggest Secretary Gates indicated, we need to recognize our limitations in predicting the scenarios and try and develop capabilities that are going to be useful and responsive in multiple and unpredictable scenarios. We need flexibility. We also, as a final point, I think the other trend that this diverseness of threats and drives us toward is to focus planning more broadly. Shouldn't just be military planning. We need to integrate military, economic, diplomatic, development planning. If we do that well, and Secretary Gates, Secretary Clinton started down that path in a partnership, you would define success, I think, in that kind of planning is that you would diffuse crises before a military solution was necessary or applicable. And if we're able to do that, I think we can call our strategies a success.
JD?
Thanks, Bill. It's a great pleasure to be here as well. When you're down at the end of the line here, it reminds me of the old saying, it's the guy was reviewing the book and he says there's much that is new and original, Unfortunately, what is original is really not his, and what is new is not very good. But I sort of began by looking at Ronald Reagan as strategist. You know, we think of him in many ways as a politician, a communicator, and all of his other manifestations. But I really think he actually was quite a good strategist. And one of the reasons I think he was able to develop a strategy that people could get behind, and as Bill pointed out, it was a strategy that picked up on a legacy of, you know, bipartisan support that had been working back through John Kennedy, Eisenhower, Harry Truman, and the like. One, he had a way of focusing things in simple terms. He was very unambiguous about where he stood with his friends, with potential enemies. Yet he also was very, very clear. And I think one of the things he brought to that was the ability to be clear about the system that we live in, the world that we live in, and to talk about it to people in that way. When I look at the international system, and again, you know, it's really easy to say, you know, our strategy has to be a defense strategy. I think Bill said, it's not that. It has to be more than that. There has to be an economic component to it, a diplomatic component, and the like. But as we look at the state system that we live in today, there's sort of three things that I think President Reagan emphasized. One is, you know, there are thugs out there, and no American president is going to be able to avoid dealing with those problems. You know, issues that you never expected as president will arise, and you have to have capabilities, and you have to have contingencies. I absolutely agree with Bill, actually. You know, when I was in the Pentagon back in the early Bush 43 days, we started talking about capability-based planning because you don't exactly know what's going to happen. But there are thugs out there, and these things are going to emerge, and you're going to have to respond to them. A second element, and maybe a broader thing, is that, you know, unfortunately in international politics, bad times return. And if you look back over the history of even the last 300 years, you see really a repetition of a theme, which is countries rising and having to be dealt with in that international system, usually by a lead country and usually with a group of allies. Whether it was, you know, France in the 17th and 18th century, or Germany in the 19th and early 20th century, or the Soviet Russia in the 20th century, what we know as the Cold War, these kinds of problems reoccur in the world. And so we see that today, and we see it really in two main areas. The first, as everybody's talking about, you know, managing the rise of China. You know, there is nothing inevitable about conflict with China. But there also is nothing inevitable about going on autopilot about what the Chinese are doing in the Far East. And if you were over at the panel earlier this morning, you heard a lot on that. The United States has to play a huge role in that. The second thing I think that is really shaping events at the political level is sort of a reordering that's going on inside the Muslim world. We're not doing it. We're watching it happen. And we're going to have, you know, it's a real question as to whether or not that world is going to move toward modernity or towards antiquity. And this is going to be a huge challenge. So consequently, not only are we going to have defense resources, but we're going to have diplomatic resources and the like focused in those areas. So those are the main geopolitical trends. Behind that, you've got technological issues that are also going to be driving and impinging on our ability to have an effective strategy. You know, defense investment in this country really used to be the driver of innovation. I think it is not likely to be the driver of innovation in the future. We're going to have to figure out ways to retain our edge in the defense technology area, by harnessing some of the things that are coming out of the private sector, not too far up the road here in the Silicon Valley and the like. We also have to deal with massive demographic shifts in the world right now. The US and most other countries, in fact, most other countries are ahead of us, are going to have to manage the effects of an aging population, increasing urbanization, and continued population growth. There are going to be 220 cities in China that have over 1 million people in them by 2025. And the call on resources to support those is enormous. So I think we have a lot of challenges. I think I want to echo something that Eric said. Strategy is really about balancing ends and means. But it's very hard to shed those ends. It's very hard to say, I'm going to stop doing something. Remember in the movie Amadeus when the emperor says to Mozart, your opera was too long. He says, well, which notes would you like me to take out, right? What are we going to ask our military to stop doing? So I think we're going to have to look at defense resources anew. Yes, we can use them more efficiently. Yes, we can save money in various places, but I think it's probably also we're going to have to consider reinvestment in defense to sustain the advantages we've had over the last 2 decades.
Tom?
We've got a big panel, so I'll try to be as quick as I can in summarizing and get to the group discussion. And you may wonder why I'm here, because I don't wear 4 stars on my shoulder. I'm not a captain of industry or a senator or anything like that. Every party needs its pooper. Every conference needs its Cassandra. That's my job here. And I'd like to pick up on a question that both JD and Eric asked. That is, what is it you want us to stop doing? Which is the question that the military is essentially posing to the nation. I think that's actually fairly clear. And it's not a partisan observation, but we have very much lost our appetite for military intervention in the Middle East, as JD said, just at the moment where the region itself is going through something of a large-scale generational change. The autocratic regimes that came to power after World War II, the sort of Nasserite regimes across the region, including the Saudi royal family, are all on very shaky ground if they haven't fallen already. And so looking back on what's happened to the military that Ronald Reagan built ostensibly to respond to the Soviet challenge, looking at what we've actually done over the past 30 years, it has been largely employed trying to sort out the Middle East to preserve a decent balance of power, not simply for the extraction of energy resources, but essentially as a global public good. And it does seem today that we're on the verge of withdrawing from that. The Asia pivot is as much a pivot away from the Middle East as it is a pivot to the Pacific. And if you compare American military posture in the Middle East today to what it was just 5 years ago, and project what it might be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, you can see that the trend line has been going down and is likely to continue to go down. That's one thing that both parties in Washington sort of seem to agree on. But is that a strategically sustainable course? As Eric said, for several generations, the balance of power in the Middle East has been a core American security interest. And even if we were to establish energy independence here in this country, that wouldn't really change the international appetite for fossil fuels, particularly among the developing economies that are the most unstable polities in the world, and particularly China, whose industrial development and social development depends on maintaining high rates of economic growth and cheap energy, or accessible energy. So as I look forward to 2025, sort of reminds me of the song from my high school years, in the year 2025 or 2525, if man is still alive, if woman can survive, what would we find? Well, if we found a Middle East where there was a squabble, as seems to be emerging, of all against all, of a Iranian-led Shia bloc versus a less well-organized sort of Sunni bloc that included the Gulf states, that included al-Qaeda and its affiliates, I think we would see a very ugly world. Not just an ugly Middle East, but an ugly world. So trying to imagine what a world looks like where the United States has lifted the cover or turned the lights back off in the kitchen when there's a lot of varmints running around. And there's more varmints, so to speak, if I can extend this analogy more than it ought to be extended. I think that's worrisome not only to the Middle East, but to the international system that the United States has created. Instead of thinking of this as kind of an aggregation of interests, I think it's better to think of it as a system. It's a whole rather than a sum of parts. And taking the American hand off or the American guarantees away from the most volatile part of the planet over the next 10 years strikes me as a recipe for big trouble. And these were the things that really brought Ronald Reagan to power and energized the military buildup that he oversaw. Remember what 1979 was like. That was the year of the Iranian hostage crisis. That was the year of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. That was the year that a group of Sunni extremists seized the Grand Mosque in Saudi Arabia. That was also the year that Saddam Hussein came to power directly in Baghdad. So it was really developments in the Middle East that occupied the structures, the force that Ronald Reagan built. Ronald Reagan built a force to defeat the Soviet Union, but it's largely been employed in trying to sort out the Middle East. I don't see why the future is going to be fundamentally different than what we've experienced over the last 30 years.
So if this panel is about looking out to the year 2025, and does budget drive strategy, or does strategy drive budget, or does it matter which drives which? One of the things I did before I came here is I decided I better find out what our current strategy is, because I decided I really didn't know. Having sat through, endless, all due respect, Eric, briefings in the Pentagon briefing room from top officials about this and that, I thought, what is our strategy? So I want to read to you what I got back from a high-level Pentagon official. And I want to quote, "The current defense strategy tells us that our forces must be capable of deterring and defeating aggression by an opportunistic adversary in one region, even when our forces are committed to a large-scale operation elsewhere. This includes being able to secure territory and populations and facilitate a transition to stable governance on a small scale for a limited period, using standing forces, and if necessary, for an extended period, using mobilized forces." One of the things that struck me in that statement is I didn't hear or see the word win. It seems to be a word not present at the moment, given, I suppose, the current realities. And we all know another defense review, yet again, is underway. And in the spring of 2014, we'll find out if there's a new defense strategy. So with that basis, I'm really fascinated because all of our speakers are talking about, in one way or the other, leapfrogging ahead into, taking the big leap into the future that we seem to be, and to carry on Tom's music analogy, still, to quote Prince, I believe, Prince and the Revolution, or are we still partying like it's 1999 somewhere in the world? So I want to start with Senator Reid and ask about this. How you keep hearing from the Pentagon, from all these officials who come testify before you, these dire predictions, we can't do this, we can't do that, but if there's a big crisis, somehow we'll do it, They come and they tell you this, we'll find a way to do it, we'll find a way to pay for it. What do you do right now? How do you bridge this gap? How do you formulate a realistic budget with all of the constraints that give you the flexibility to not know when and where you're going to get hit in the head?
Well, I think we all have to recognize that we are under significant budget pressure, and hopefully we're working now to relieve some of that through appropriations bills that are adequate but not robust, and some way to suspend or change sequestration so it doesn't impact across the board and significantly against our interests. But I think even working through that, we're going to face a period of time of constrained budgets for the Department of Defense. That's the reality. So there has to be, I think, first and there always is, a constant search for savings, for ways in which we can do things more efficiently. That goes on constantly. But that's probably not in and of itself sufficient to bridge the gap between the capabilities that our military thinks are essential and the resources they can generate internally. But that has to go on. I think in terms of strategy, I'm more sort of simplistic view of the strategy, which is we have to have the capability to preempt terrorist groups that threaten our nation, and then we have to have the capability and capacity to deter anyone in many regions of the world who would destabilize those regions, the Middle East, Tom talked about. So trying to put the resources behind that type of strategy is something at the first order. And then, the problem is complicated because we have to begin to modernize our force as well as maintain the current forces for current issues. So, there's not an easy answer here, but going back, I think, to the point you raised and the point Eric suggested is the Mike Tyson quote, when you get hit in the head. When we get hit in the head, guess what? We suddenly have a major threat. We take all our resources, we put it towards that threat. Everything else is an economy of force. I think that's the way we've always fought. And we'll do it again. The question, I think, and the question I think we have to answer is, one, we'd like to have some warning before we get hit in the head. Two, we'd like to be able to, in terms of economy of force efforts, make those as minimal as possible so we have adequate resources to confront and defeat and win the battle if we do get suddenly hit in the head.
And when we talk about getting hit in the head, and I'll ask the other panelists to weigh in on this, I mean, getting hit in the head these days perhaps is analogous, heaven forbid, an IED, a suicide car bomber, God forbid, at a U.S. embassy somewhere in the world, and something terrible happens, and suddenly the world has changed for U.S. national security. A threat has happened, it has to be addressed. You see what's behind it, you may have other targets, etc. So this happens in an era of rapid, hyper decision-making. We always hear about getting inside the enemy's decision cycle. That enemy, that adversary may be very low-tech and able to move a lot faster than the United States can. I think, Bill, you talked about the notion of just, and you all did in a way, overhauling it all. Are we still in a strategy where we're talking about how many fighter aircraft we need, how many of this, how many of that, what are the new systems we need, when it could be a suicide car bomber or a cyber attack bringing down a power grid? How do you plan for all that? If you were still Deputy Secretary, what's your advice? Don't be laughing. How do you plan for all of that? Minimal budget, you got no idea fundamentally where the next hit's coming.
Well, I think there's a couple of things there. I mean, I think what we have to recognize is not so much, we get away from fighters or force structure constructs, but there are some trends out there that need to change the way we think about things. That For example, for centuries, lethality in warfare was largely linear. It was a case where the larger, more sophisticated nation states controlled most of the high-end capabilities. That's broken down. I mean, it's broken down over a couple of decades, but at this point you have high-end cyber capabilities can be available to terrorist groups. We have a couple of rogue states in Iran and North Korea either just over the threshold or on the threshold of nuclear capabilities. We have an activity going on now in Syria to try and take out the mass destruction capability of chemical weapons from essentially one of the really a lower end state. So I think in our planning we have to recognize this linearity that we used to base our planning on isn't there. Second, I think that as the U.S. has developed what is clearly the most sophisticated and capable military the world's ever seen, that has pushed our adversaries to avoid like-on-like conflict. They're looking for asymmetrical advantages, whether it's area denial or whether it's cyber capabilities to take advantage of our reliance on information technology. Again, I think our planning needs to take account of these trends rather than just trying to match, fighter wing for fighter wing, ship for ship, and so on.
Because it's not out there anymore. I mean,
exactly. Well, there's some of that, but I don't think that's not the direction the threat's going to come from.
So Eric, JD, and Tom, weigh in on this point. How do you adjust? How do you go to Congress and say, I need, $36 billion for, the 6th generation fighter aircraft, when you really need maybe better human intelligence gathering in some nasty corner of the world?
But Barbara, I think going back to the point about prioritizing future capability over current capacity, when you do that, one of the things you have to realize, particularly given how long it takes us to field anything, and I think all of us would agree we need to get that down, as Chairman McKeon said, we can't have a 20-year time frame for deployment of capability anymore. But you're betting essentially that the future capabilities you're going to need 20 years from now are actually encompassed in the suite of capabilities you're building in the program of record. And I'm not 100% convinced that that's the case. So there was, I think, a very good discussion this morning in the panel on the rebalance to Asia about directed energy and what Bob Work was calling electronic weapons. My view is we need to have a lot more investment in that. There has been, I think, under Bill's leadership, a lot more investment in cyber capability. I think we still need to do something of that. But I do think we need to have a debate about this. I mean, I agree with Bill, but there are also some areas, including the ones discussed in the panel previous this morning, where we do have to think about force on force as well. So we've got to be able to keep both of those ideas, I think, in our head at the same time. How do we deal with force on force, but also how do we deal with the asymmetric? And that, I think, is the tension that people are facing as they're trying to square the circle.
JD, Tom, I want you both to weigh in.
Well, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Eric said. To some degree, since the fall of the Soviet Union and the falling apart of the Warsaw Pact, really through the period of the late Bush 41, Clinton administration, Bush 43 administration, we've been living in a fairly rarefied era in the sense that while there have been a lot of problems in the Middle East and elsewhere, and obviously post 9/11 was the knock in the head, we have not really had to deal with what we thought or would believe would be a peer competitor. And I think if you think back over the history of the United States, that's a relatively short period of time. The 19th century, we were able to essentially rely on the British and stay distant from the rest of the world. But in the 20th century, we were seized with real big problems. That's not necessarily a natural state of being. We may well find ourselves over the next 10, 15, 25 years facing countries with not only asymmetric capabilities, but also real military advantages over us, particularly in certain geographic regions. Obviously, the Far East is an example of that.
Give us some examples.
Well, the Far East. I mean, you know, if you look at I don't want to recount what the panel over there talked about, but if you look at the buildup of Chinese capabilities, you know, it's not inconceivable that by 2025, at the current rate of growth, the Chinese defense budget would be equal to ours. Yet their focus is going to be in their backyard. They're going to be bringing all those resources to bear in the Far Eastern region, at least initially. So we're going to have a lot of challenges. So I think, unfortunately, we have to continue to develop capabilities to do that kind of higher-end state-on-state thing, while we're also dealing with asymmetric threats. And I think, in a way, this gets back to a point that Bill made about capability-based stuff. We need our military platforms to be as flexible and modular as they possibly can, so that as missions change, and they may change over fairly small periods of time, weeks or even days, that you can reconfigure those military capabilities and use them in a broader set of mission requirements.
So Tom, what do? Do you stick with, you know, the general game plan? Do you have a revolution here in strategy?
No, I'm I'm a conservative. I'm anti-revolutionary, just as a matter of principle. But I mean, this conversation here very much reprises the defense conversation of the last generation, obsessed with technology, obsessed with tactics, obsessed with operational concepts, and devoid of strategic consideration. I also was listening to the Asia panel, and again, it was all about anti-access and aerial denial and stuff like that, and it became a conversation about systems. We have been trying to reason up from a group of systems, whether they're the legacy program of record or capabilities that we imagine, technologies that are in the laboratory, and then we're trying to figure out, well, what can we do with this stuff? Rather than saying, as I think your question went exactly to it, what does victory look like? What is it we're trying to achieve? And the reason that we have all the capabilities that we have is because there's a wide variety of things. It's not because the world is really, or our desires for the world are that uncertain. It's because they demand that we do a wide variety of things. And if the choice becomes simply because of lack of resources, we have to give up. You know, we have to tell them what we don't want them to do. That's also telling your enemies, that's issuing an invitation to them. That's saying, here's something that you won't have to worry about the Americans messing you about with if you live in the Middle East, for example, and you have desires of your own. So again, until we actually follow the traditional process of saying, this is what we're trying to achieve, this is what victory looks like, here, and there are many strategies for getting. Strategies are how-to answers. How do I get to where I want to go? What path do I take? And then you can figure out, what particular systems are most valuable, what capabilities are most flexible, and so on and so forth. I just think if you look at the pattern of American behavior over the course of time, if the goal is to preserve the system, then you have to do a lot of stuff all over the place.
So Senator Reed, what do you want to hear from the Pentagon, from the White House, from the National Security Council now? Because if it may not be a revolution, but perhaps it's more of an evolution, but in an era of, the bottom line, and then we'll get to some questions, minimal resources, maximum uncertainty, basically sticking with perhaps a model of military planning that has existed for decades. What has to happen now? What do you want to hear?
Well, I think this has been an extraordinarily thoughtful discussion, listening to my colleagues, and it's prompted me to sort of pose all the questions and analysis in slightly different ways. One of the issues is, do we want to shape the environment, or do we want to be prepared to react to the environment? And that, I think, might be the touchstone for strategic thinking. If you're in a mode of reaction, then you measure threats, you kind of set, sort of your pieces against the other folks. You think ahead of what they might have. If you want to shape, that's a much more proactive and more dynamic role. And it encompasses what Bill and others have said, not just a military strategy, but a diplomatic economic strategy, emphasizing capacity building, doing a lot of things. And frankly, many of those things don't command great support within the budget, to be honest.
Can we afford to still shape our world?
That's one of the questions that we're talking about right now. We were briefly chatting before the events. I mean, we recognized in 1944, 1945, that unless we significantly rebuilt Europe, we would have a legacy of disaster before us. And so we sent divisions over, obviously, but we sent a lot of assistance, a lot of aid. We got those economies. They didn't fall to internal pressure, and they were strong enough to withstand the expansion of the Soviet Union. We shaped the environment there. And we're now in this period of history where we're reacting to attempts, frankly, to shape the environment in the Middle East that have worked out not as efficiently as many thought. We're naturally trying to recoup, refigure our approach. So I think eventually, again, why this discussion is so thoughtful is that we have to make a fundamental kind of decision of how much we're doing in terms of shaping, how much reacting, how much should we devote to the non-kinetic aspects of our policy. And I tell you what you all know, in an atmosphere of very, very difficult economic challenges at home, which shape as much of the political process as the international threats and the international issues we talked about. When you go back up to Cranston, Rhode Island, or Thousand Oaks, California, the question is how are we dealing with the emergent Shia-Sunni conflict, it's where's my job? So I think we have to recognize that too. So we have a multiple level of tasks, but I think the most coherent thing that I could hear, and particularly benefiting from the discussion, is a conscious discussion of the shaping aspect versus what we're going to react to.
And so now I'm going to invoke moderator's privilege and ask the chairman in the front row his view on this, because, I mean, maybe you want, yep, you're up. Maybe you could just step the microphone for 1 second so everybody can hear you. I hope you don't mind. You don't mind, come on.
Barbara, can I...
We want to hear from, please, while the chairman is making his way to the microphone.
While he's getting the microphone, can I just go back to something you said, because Senator Reed's comment, which I completely agree with, precipitated this thought. You asked him earlier how it could be that the chiefs come up and testify that we can't do this, can't do that, but if something happens,
but if we had to, we will.
We'll. Look, we still have a great deal of military capability. We still have, for all the problems we've been discussing. But what they're really saying is, if we have to execute our war plans today, because of a lack of investment over the last 20 years, we're still operating with platforms that essentially were the product of the buildup that took place under President Carter and under President Reagan. We would have to do it slower, with greater difficulty, with more casualties, with greater risk, et cetera. But we would still do it. And so the answer would we would win, but we would win ugly. And that, I think, is the reality. What we're wrestling with in this drawdown, compared to previous drawdowns, is that after war, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War, is in all those other drawdowns, we essentially got the money from reducing the size of the force. But the force has become so expensive today, and because we didn't grow it that much during the course of the last decade, the savings can't be found there. And so we're looking in places where we've already been underinvesting. And that, I think, is the nub of the problem we face.
And Mr. Chairman, I apologize for putting you on the spot, but it's too good an opportunity with you here not to hear from you on this as well. Because, I mean, as everyone is saying here, and this is a reporter's question, years and years and years, you see the Pentagon say, gloom and doom, we can't do this, we can't do that. And yet they do find a way to do it. So the same question I had for Senator Reed. what do you want to hear from the Pentagon leadership right now that can help you you and the committee make the decision about where that line is plumbed between too much risk, not enough readiness, and not winning ugly, but winning when you need to? Can I just ask you your thoughts on that?
Sure.
Thank you. Invite me back still next year.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about this for a couple of years, the sequestration and what it's done to us. But people focus on sequestration. Before that, we cut $487 billion. The sequestration comes on top of that. And then we've also had OCO for the last 10, 12 years. And I know that if they couldn't get things out of the regular budget, they would take it out of OCO. That's also going away. So the cuts are deeper than most people really understand. I was just talking to one of our military leaders, and yesterday I was talking to our budget chairman. He was trying to tell me where we are on the negotiation and kind of what we were going to have to go along with. And I said, I'm not going along anymore. I'm the ultimate team player. I've always been with leadership. I've always voted for whatever they finally work out. But I said, when we're done with all these kabuki dances that we're doing now, and we get down to the final vote after this budget session, if we don't get adequate resources back to the military, the whole Armed Services Committee will be voting against budget, which means probably going to have a hard time getting anything passed. And the reason is, I am so concerned. When we talk about winning ugly, what we're talking about is losing a lot of lives. And we've done that historically. When we started going across northern Africa in World War II, we were sending people that had been training with wooden rifles that were basically fodder that we were putting out there to buy time. Korea, we almost got pushed into the ocean, the same type of thing. We lost a lot of lives. And that's happened to us historically. And this is the first time we've had the drawdown during the war. Usually we wait till the war's over before we decimate the military. We're doing it now during wartime. Hence, this is why we're here. This is what we're talking about. What we need to refocus. We cannot save, one of the things I mentioned today, Reagan's words, strong defense, strong industrial base, but also strong economics. We're suffering right now in the economics, and we've tried to fix most of it on the backs of the military. We cut 50% on that first budget control agreement out of the military of our domestic spending, and they only account for 17, 18% of our spending. So disproportionately, they were cut back. We've got to get to the point, I think, where we really look at our overall spending needs. The big debate we have between the parties, more taxes, more cuts. What we really need to do, we can't solve it with either of those, is we've got to grow the economy back. We've got to get people back to work. That means get the government off their backs. Reagan, I've been reading a lot about him lately, said, you know, we find we can adjust how people operate. If you tax something, you get less of it. If you let people go, let them go out and use their ingenuity and ease up the tax burden on them, they'll create a lot of things. They'll do a lot of things. So it's a broad debate, hence these experts here and in the other panels that again is really important discussion, but it's all right now focused on the budget committee in Washington, how that.
And it sounds like you've got, and then I promise to let you sit down. You have bipartisan agreement, if you will, within your own committee that you guys are not going to support, to some extent, a level of funding.
I guess what I was telling our leadership is the Republicans on the committee will not vote for it, and I'm assuming because the Democrats also, the Democrats on our committee works in a bipartisan way.
Exactly.
Our bill passed out of committee earlier this year, 59-2. we may disagree on a few things, but we all understand that it's our responsibility on that committee to look after those who are willing to put their lives on the line for us. So I'm just assuming, and I haven't gotten into this with Adam because, again, we get to the tax, no tax discussion. But I assume if it comes out and we see that we've cut the military to the point where we don't think they can take it. And I'll tell you, the generals are to the point where they'll take just about whatever you give them, and they'll just make it work because that's how their training has been for 30, 40 years. But it's up to us to make sure that they have what they need. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for... And so let's take some questions, and if somebody doesn't get up and ask some, I'll call on them and make them. Sir, go to I think there's a microphone right over to your side. And tell us who you are and who you'd like your question to go to.
My name is Dennis Anderson. I'm a veteran Iraq embed reporter and a bit of a fan of the chairman for his taking the stand he has. And so that's what my question is about capabilities. I think Americans generally have an admiration bordering on hero worship for our special operations forces. But I think I would worry in the time ahead with this large drawdown that is onrushing, that they'll be left with the idea, well, we're going to do this with drones and we're going to do this with special operations forces, so we will zap bad guys here and there. And I wonder how you build consensus in the country to understand, do you understand that you do need to have force projection? I think about the denuding of the ground forces after this war, and I can't see that as being a good thing. I also can't see it as being a particularly good thing to have the outflow of veterans who are virtually being cashiered flowing into the economy without supports for them. So that may be a homily, but it invites a response.
So who would like to take, Tom, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, we have built an incredible capability over the past 10 years, something that did not exist previously. You know, our ability to conduct a global manhunt is really unprecedented and remarkable, but it's a little bit addictive. And if you think of the movie, or if you've seen the movie Zero Dark 30, I think that's what people think what the war has been like. There were a bunch of intelligence analysts and guys who, collected and sifted through a big pile of information, and then magically halfway through the movie, SEAL Team 6 shows up and goes on the raid. Well, how'd those guys get there? There's nothing wrong with the movie per se in that regard, but it leaves out a lot. I fear that we've just, again, become addicted to this way of warfare, as effective and as devastating as it's been. Not even SEALs Team 6 or Delta can do everything. And even the smartest, most sophisticated forms of intelligence collection aren't the only answer. So I am worried that model of warfare will be taken as a substitute for other forms of capability that actually provide the platform, provide the framework in which this model has become so successful.
But does anybody see a scenario realistically in which we would again employ large land force capability? I mean, certainly Secretary Gates did not. He thought the idea was fairly ludicrous that we would ever do this again. JD? Do you see it?
I would turn the question a slightly different way, which is to say, shouldn't we try to create the conditions where we would never have to use large land force capability again? And I would agree, yes, nobody wants high-end conventional war. Very ugly. The last time we really did it was in Iraq in 2003. And we were obviously not doing it against a peer competitor. But I think from the standpoint of, what do we want to see, let's say, in the Far East? We want to create a circumstance there where, as China rises and it develops more military capability, which it's going to, that they wake up every morning and say, today's not the day that we want to use military capability in this theater. We would rather see if we can work with the United States, see if we can work with other countries in the region. So we need a strategy, I think, that says, yes, we need to demonstrate the ability to deter high-end conventional capability. We need to work with our allies to make sure that we have the bases, the capability, their support. Many of those countries can bring great capability to us in the region, so that as China grows, China matures, China changes, it changes in a way where we avoid that kind of threat.
The other part I might add is I agree with the premise that the hardest planning issue is where you would use large ground forces. The air, naval, it's easier to see the scenarios, but that's somewhat where I was going with the danger of scenario-based planning. We saw this somewhat similar situation in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended. There was a similar lack of imagination. We couldn't quite imagine where we were going to use large ground forces. Yet we had, two large wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, one in Afghanistan in the last 2 decades, none of which was foreseen. So I agree that it's hard to imagine those circumstances. On the other hand, I think it's dangerous to think that we are predicting the future with any accuracy.
Let me get to this gentleman's question, sir.
My name is Paul Grossgold, a local citizen and retired naval officer. It seems as though wherever we look, we see instability, but we don't only see instability, we see increasing instability. And in addition to that, it seems, again, to a distant observer, that the trends are in the wrong direction and that we continue to get surprised by global events. The way Egypt has gone and Syria and Iran, we seem to be reacting much more than we're trying to shape, and that's what we're all here to talk about today. And so the question is really, is this a failure of American leadership at a national level, or is it also a factor of a world that's changing to where one nation, even the only world superpower, is not as relevant in all of the regions, or is it something in between, and where do we need to go from here?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. If you look at the phenomenon in the Arab Spring, it was driven in part by a reaction to very authoritarian governments, was always simmering, but it seemed to be the catalyst was social media communication, the ability to do things that 5 or 10 years ago was not feasible technically, and that helped drive it, and that's going to get more dramatic in the days ahead as technology improves and is dispersed. So we came through a century of nationalism and lots of other isms, and now it's transnational, global. You can communicate, you can move, you can travel. So I think what we're going to see is it's less the ability of any major nation to influence other nations has been diminished because nationality and borders are less important today than they were 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. So we're in this turbulent, dynamic world that is going to be driven as much by the asymmetric small groups, social media, as it is going to be by statesmen, and mostly in the past statesmen and stateswomen, sitting down and saying, how can we work together, how can we deal with this, recognize hierarchies of power, et cetera. So I think we're in for a much different environment in terms of the political spectrum than we became accustomed to during the last century.
And anybody else has any questions, please stand up and go to a microphone.
I just
what Senator Reid said. You know, my colleague at the Foreign Policy Initiative, Bob Kagan, published a book last year called The World America Made. And the point he was making was the current international system was one that we largely created after 1945. All of us have grown up, I think, and come to political maturity in that post-war era in which we have taken the notion that the United States has this outsized role in the world and maintains these alliances as the natural order of things. In fact, it's quite extraordinary if you look at our national history going back to the beginning, when we were very reluctant for the longest part of our history to take on political obligations outside of this hemisphere anyway, in the way that we have since 1945. And I worry that we are now in a place where the traditional support for the strong national defense that underpins all of that, this system that we created has done a lot for the world and a lot for the United States and made us very prosperous, but it requires what my former boss George Shultz, Ronald Reagan, Secretary of State, used to say, constant tending of the garden. And I'm afraid that, particularly when I look up on the Hill, the sort of coalition of blue dog Democrats and internationalist Republicans that used to support the underpinnings of all this is fraying at both ends. We don't have as many Democrats who, like Senator Reid, are committed to strong national defense. We don't have, in the Republican Party, we don't have as much commitment to internationalism as we once did. And I think that the two of those are creating many of the pressures we've been discussing in this panel.
Sir, tell us who you are and who you'd like your question to go to.
Yes, my name is Bob Camarillo. I am a veteran, Marine veteran from Korea and Vietnam. And just with one of the statements you made about not being prepared and some of the consequences of not being prepared, when we landed in Incheon, if we had not have called every reserve, taken every band that existed in the Marine Corps, we had, Marines here probably don't even know it, we didn't know that. I was already on active duty. When we landed there, if we had not have had the reserves, we could not have landed in Incheon. 47% of the forces that landed there were reservists. I was on active duty already. They were considered to be combat ready if they had 2 summer camps, that's 4 weeks of training, and 2 years in the reserves. Look it up in the history. And yet, they did a pretty good job because we had so many Second World War veterans. At a battle called the Chosin Reservoir, the first 2 replacement draft, and it was a pretty tough battle. We still had Marines that were coming into combat that had never been through, they'd been through 30 days of training in the infantry school and had never been to the Marine Corps. The Army suffered terribly because most of them were constabulary forces. They were intermixed with Korean forces who didn't speak English. And they got savage. They got beat up pretty badly. That is the consequence of not being prepared. On the other hand, what you're doing now and what you're going to prepare, one thing that I have not really heard very much is about building alliances with other people so we don't have to go into this alone, number one. Number two, whether it's asymmetric war, we have a big land battle, you're going to have to replace supply material. Do we have the industrial base like we had in the Second World War that was able to develop and prepare itself ready? I haven't heard a lot of comment. We've sent all of our manufacturing overseas. We've allowed it to go there. What are we doing to build up this base? How are we going to gear up if something serious happens with where you need a large deployment? And even asymmetric war in Vietnam, we needed some materials. We couldn't fight without that. I haven't heard that mentioned.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your service to the country. I'd like to ask Senator Reid to address that because I know the Defense Industrial Base is something, even this week, he's been looking at very closely.
No, I'm going to defer also to my colleagues because they're, and Bill Lynn, as the former second Deputy Secretary of Defense, knows these issues very well. But, you know, we have a robust defense industrial base. and we have to maintain it. And that's one of the pressures now in terms of this budget battle, because it's very difficult in the short run, Eric pointed this out, to recoup lots of personnel costs. We've already have a relatively small size force. So the first place you go, and he alluded to that, is readiness and training. And then the second place you go is procurement. And so this is at the heart of this whole debate about what will be the top line for defense. And it'll affect, not immediately, but over time, defense industrial base. We still have, I think, the most sophisticated platforms in the world by far, in terms of probably every dimension, sea, land, air. We want to keep that, because that means more effectiveness, and it also saves the lives of our men and women that use these systems. So I think with respect to the defense industrial base, we're at a critical point, but I don't think we're at a point yet where we're in danger of losing our ability to build. What everyone has commented this morning, as well as on this panel, is that, one, it takes a lot longer to build a platform than it should, and they usually turn out to be a lot more expensive than they should. And our job in Congress is to make sure that we get better value and more efficient production, and we have to do more, frankly, in that regard.
Bill, I'll ask you to weigh in real quick. We have one last question. I have two last questions here. We'll see who we can get to, but let me ask you to weigh in. We have 5 minutes.
On the industrial base. I agree with Senator Reid. I think the current state of our industrial base is quite strong. We have a diverse set of capabilities, a diverse set of companies with the ability to supply them. I think the challenge is, in the current environment, is the lack of planning. Eric and others talked about the level of defense spending, which has dropped. It's also the way in which it's dropping, which is because there is no predictability. There's no stability, and in some ways, the Defense Department could plan to any reasonable level of defense spending, but to ask them to do 1, 2, 3 budgets every year, the department can't pivot that quickly. It has to make force structure decisions, has to make investment decisions that are real multi-year in their nature, and then the industrial base has to react to that set of decisions.
It's not very orderly.
It's not. Well, it's worse than disorderly. What happens is you're losing more capability than you need to, given the level of spending, just because of the nature of the way we're doing this. So in addition to getting the appropriate level of defense spending, I think what we need to see is some sort of at least midterm, 2, 3, 4 year stability, predictability, and the level of resources that would be available to defense.
Before we all get
That's the single most important thing I think you do for the industrial
Before
base.
we all get the hook here, especially me. Sir, you have a quick question?
Thank you. My name is Mike Winnerstig. I work for the Swedish Defense Research Agency. I guess we all kind of tend to agree that Ronald Reagan and the West won the Cold War, but I have a feeling that this has led us to disregard any potential in terms of adversarial relationships to the Russia of today. And I would like somebody in the panel to assess the relationship between the United States and Russia, especially in terms of any linkages to China, which is a key point here. Thanks.
JD, real quick, and then I want to get to the congressman.
There was a great quote from one of the UK prime ministers, about the question of from his perspective, did it matter whether there was a Soviet or a Russian in the Kremlin with respect to access to the Black Sea? I mean, Russia is a big country. It has robust military capabilities. It has a lot of thermonuclear weapons, and it's now reinvesting in that capability. So yeah, it continues. Now, I think there's a big difference between that and the Soviet Union. There's a big difference between that and a country that had a fairly organized and hostile ideology to the West. So I think overall this is this was in fact a win of the Cold War. But it doesn't mean that it isn't an issue among particularly our Eastern European allies. I was ambassador to Romania. I can tell you, people of the countries that are on the front line there have a lot of concern about that. And the concern is not just military; it also extends into political influence and the like.
Okay.
And the most troubling aspect of this has really been the direction of Russian democracy. And where I think 10 years ago we all had some hope that this was going to move in a more positive direction, it has definitely moved in a negative direction.
Our last question, sir.
Well, I'll be quick. I'm Elliot Engel. I'm the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and like Chairman McKeon's committee, we conduct our committee in a very bipartisan fashion as well. I want to thank you for an excellent panel. I just want to say an observation. I've been around Washington for a long time now. The way I see it, and I said this in the other panel, I voted against the sequestration. I think it's one of the worst things we could do, one of the stupidest things we could have done. And I think we've got to unravel it, get rid of it somehow or other, because until we get rid of it, we're only talking about more cuts. We're not talking about being smart and deciding for ourselves where we're going to cut and where we're not going to cut. I think essentially Congress has to make some decisions, and the decisions we really need to make are a combination of cutting programs and having revenue raisers. I don't think you can do all of one or all of another, but we've got to do it. And I think we can't just keep kicking the can down the road. We need a robust defense, which I'm for. We need to be a tragedy if these programs were cut. But my fear is that we've kicked the can now down to January and February, and that we are really buying more of the same of what we've had for the past several years. Hopefully we can grow the economy ultimately, but I think that as long as we are in dire straits. Look, we fought the Iraq War. We didn't pay for it. We're suffering because of that now. I supported the war. I voted for it. But we didn't handle ourselves right, and we're sort of paying the price now for what we didn't do, for not having fiscal responsibility early on. We're paying the price for it today. So I don't know if anyone would care to comment. I don't know if there's time to comment, but thank you all very, very much.
All right, well, thank you, sir, for your observations. I think they're most valuable. We have time for a quick comment if anybody wants to, or I'm looking at the hidden clock behind the shrubs here, and I think I'm about to get the hook. So maybe we'll just leave it at that. Thank you, Congressman. Everybody, thank you so much for a really great panel. Microphone.